Every story you hear is recorded by me in my own voice for hours at a time. No AI narration, just dedication and a love for great stories. If you appreciate that, hit subscribe. I still remember the sound, not because it was loud, not because it shook the mountains, but because every person who heard it knew deep inside that it wasn't thunder. The summer of 1887 had been unusually dry in the northern reaches of the Rocky Mountains. For weeks, the sky remained cloudless. Rivers shrank into narrow streams. The pine forests crackled beneath the sun. Hunters complained that game had become scarce. And old tribal elders spoke quietly among themselves whenever the weather was mentioned. They said the sky felt wrong. Most settlers laughed at such warnings. The old stories belonged to another age. At least that was what everyone believed. My name was Thomas Mercer, and at 27 years old, I worked as a surveyor, mapping remote stretches of wilderness that few white settlers had ever seen. My job often took me far beyond roads, beyond cabins, beyond any sign of civilization. That was how I found myself alone on a high ridge overlooking a valley that local tribes refused to enter. They called it the Valley of the Sleeping Storm. No one could explain why. The place looked ordinary enough. Dark forests blanketed the slopes below. Jagged cliffs rose from the earth like broken teeth. A river wound through the center of the valley, reflecting the afternoon sunlight. Beautiful, peaceful, silent. Yet every guide I had spoken with refused to camp there. One old man from the nearby tribe had stared at me for several moments before speaking. "You can walk through that valley," he said. His eyes never left mine. "But if the clouds come, leave." I laughed. "What clouds?" "The ones that don't belong there." That answer annoyed me more than it frightened me. People in those days blamed every strange sound and every unexplained event on spirits or monsters. I considered myself a practical man. Storms were storms. Birds were birds. Stories were stories, nothing more. So I ignored the warning. The following morning, I descended into the valley. At first, everything seemed normal. The air was cool. The forest smelled of pine and damp earth. Birds sang from the treetops. Sunlight filtered through the branches above. I spent most of the day taking measurements and sketching landmarks. By late afternoon, I had nearly completed my work. That was when the silence began. At first, I didn't notice it. Then gradually something felt different. The birds had stopped singing. The insects had stopped buzzing. Even the wind seemed to disappear. The entire valley had become unnaturally still. I looked around. Nothing moved. Not a single branch. Not a single leaf. The silence pressed against my ears. For reasons I couldn't explain, I suddenly remembered the old man's warning. If the clouds come, leave. I glanced toward the mountains. The sky remained clear, not a cloud in sight, yet unease settled into my stomach. I packed my equipment and started toward the northern trail. Half an hour later, I heard the first sound, a distant rumble, low, deep, far away. I stopped walking. Thunder, I thought. Except there were still no clouds. The sky above remained bright blue. The sound came again. This time, it lasted longer. A rolling vibration that seemed to travel through the ground itself. I felt it in my boots. The trees around me trembled. A flock of birds suddenly exploded from the forest ahead. Hundreds of them. They rose into the air in complete panic. Not flying in a single direction, scattering, fleeing, as if something enormous had entered the valley. My heartbeat quickened. The rumbling came again. Closer, much closer. I looked upward. Still nothing. No storm, no dark clouds, no explanation. Then one of the birds fell from the sky. At first I thought it had been shot, but there was no gunshot. The bird simply dropped. Its wings folded, its body plunged into the trees below. Another followed, then another. The entire flock suddenly changed direction, fleeing toward the south as fast as they could. Whatever frightened them was coming from the north, and it was approaching rapidly. I heard branches snapping somewhere beyond the ridgeline. A deep rushing sound followed, like powerful wind, yet the air around me remained perfectly still. The contradiction made no sense. Then the sunlight vanished, not completely, just enough for the forest to darken. I froze. Slowly I looked down at the ground. A shadow was moving across the valley, a shadow far larger than any eagle, far larger than any known bird. The darkness swept over the treetops like a passing cloud, except when I looked upward, there were still no clouds, only sky, endless blue sky, and something crossing it, something so high above the earth that my eyes struggled to focus. For a brief moment I saw a shape, enormous wings, a body darker than the storm clouds that had not yet formed, a silhouette moving across the heavens. Then came a single wing beat. The sound that followed was unlike anything I had ever heard. The mountains shook, the valley echoed, and the sky itself seemed to roar. I fell to one knee, not from fear, from the force of it. The noise rolled across the wilderness like cannon fire, thunder, yet there were still no clouds, no lightning, no storm, only that impossible shape disappearing into the northern horizon. And as I stared after it, a single realization crept into my mind. The old stories had not been talking about weather. They had been talking about something that brought the weather with it, and somewhere beyond those mountains, it was still flying. I did not sleep that night, even after leaving the valley, even after putting miles between myself and whatever I had seen. I could not convince myself that it had been an illusion. The shadow had been real, the sound had been real, and those wings, God help me, those wings had been real too. I reached a small logging camp shortly after sunset. The camp consisted of 6 cabins clustered beside a river. Smoke drifted from stone chimneys and lanterns glowed in the growing darkness. Normally, the sight would have comforted me. Instead, I felt as though I had brought something back with me. The men noticed immediately that something was wrong. "You look like you've seen a ghost," one of them joked. I forced a smile. "Just a long day." But my hands trembled as I ate supper. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that impossible silhouette crossing the sky. Eventually, I asked a question. "Has everyone ever seen a large bird around here?" The laughter stopped. Not completely, just enough. Several men exchanged glances. That reaction told me more than any answer could. An old logger named Franklin leaned back in his chair. "How large?" I hesitated. Then I held my hands apart. "Much larger than an eagle." Nobody laughed. The room became strangely quiet. Franklin stared into the fire. Finally, he spoke. "Stay away from the northern mountains." I frowned. "Why?" He looked up. "Because things live there." The answer irritated me. It sounded exactly like the stories I had spent my entire life dismissing. "What kind of things?" Franklin didn't respond immediately. When he finally did, his voice had dropped almost to a whisper. The tribes call it Thunderbird. Several men immediately looked uncomfortable. One crossed himself. Another stood up and left the room altogether. I felt a chill crawl down my spine, not because of the name, because of the fear it created. There were hard men, loggers, hunters, men who faced blizzards, bears, and mountain lions without hesitation. Yet the word alone seemed to unsettle them. Franklin poked at the fire. They say its wings make thunder. I nearly dropped my cup. The memory of that deafening roar echoed through my mind. The stories say lightning comes from its eyes, he continued. And when it flies over a place, storms follow behind it. Outside, the wind suddenly began to rise. The timing sent a shiver through the room. A loose shutter slammed against one of the cabins. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The sound seemed louder than it should have been. Franklin looked toward the window. You heard it, didn't you? I nodded slowly. The old logger stared into the flames. I heard it too. The room froze. What? 3 years ago. His voice had become distant, as though he were remembering something he wished he could forget. We were cutting timber near Black Ridge. The fire crackled softly. There were 6 of us. He swallowed. The day started clear, not a cloud anywhere. Then the animals began running. Every person in the room listened. The deer came first. He paused. Then the elk. Another pause. Then the wolves. That got everyone's attention. Predators and prey fleeing together. Nature ignored its own rules only when something worse appeared. Franklin continued. They weren't hunting each other. His eyes narrowed. They were escaping. A gust of wind rattled the cabin walls. No one interrupted. Then we heard the thunder. The room remained silent. There were no clouds. Another pause. No storm. My stomach tightened. The story matched my own experience exactly. Franklin stared into the fire. Then the shadow came. A younger logger laughed nervously. A cloud? Franklin looked at him. The expression on his face erased the smile instantly. No. The old man's voice was firm. It wasn't a cloud. The room felt silent again. I saw wings. A long pause followed. Then he whispered the words that haunted me for years afterward. Wings bigger than the trees. Outside, thunder suddenly rolled across the mountains. Everyone looked toward the door. This time there were clouds, dark clouds, dozens of them. They had appeared so quickly that nobody had noticed their arrival. The sky beyond the window had transformed into a sea of black. Lightning flashed in the distance. A moment later came another rumble, much louder, much deeper. My blood ran cold. It sounded familiar, too familiar. Franklin stood. The color had drained from his face. No. One word, barely audible, yet filled with dread. Another flash illuminated the camp. For the briefest moment, every cabin, every tree, every face glowed white. Then darkness returned. The wind intensified. Rain began to fall, not gently, violently, as though the storm had been waiting just beyond the horizon. A cabin door burst open. One of the loggers stumbled inside, soaked and terrified. His eyes were wide with panic. Get inside. We are inside, someone snapped. The man shook his head frantically. No. He pointed toward the mountains. I saw something. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The terrified logger swallowed. Then he spoke 4 words. 4 words that would change everything. It's coming this way. At that exact moment, a flash of lightning illuminated the sky above the northern peaks, and for less than a second, something enormous appeared inside the storm, not beneath it, not flying through it, inside it, as though the storm itself belonged to the creature. The shape vanished immediately, but everyone had seen it. The wings, the impossible size, the darkness moving among the clouds, and then came the sound. One tremendous wing beat. The thunder that followed shook every cabin in the camp, and somewhere beyond the storm, something ancient was flying toward us. The storm should not have existed. That was the first thing I realized as the night unfolded. Only an hour earlier, the sky had been clear. Now black clouds stretched from horizon to horizon, swallowing the stars and turning the mountains into jagged silhouettes against flashes of lightning. It was as though an entire storm system had appeared from nowhere, and every person inside the logging camp knew exactly what everyone else was thinking. The creature. Nobody wanted to say the word aloud, but it lingered in the room like an unwelcome guest. Thunder rolled again. The cabin walls vibrated. A lantern hanging from a beam swayed gently back and forth. Outside, rain hammered the rooftops. Franklin sat near the fire, staring into the flames. His face looked older than it had only an hour before. I finally broke the silence. What is Thunderbird? The question hung in the air. Several men looked uncomfortable. One muttered a prayer beneath his breath. Franklin slowly raised his eyes. You really want to know? I nodded. The old logger glanced toward the storm outside. Then he spoke. You're asking the wrong people. Before I could reply, the cabin door opened. Everyone turned. An old native man stepped inside. The storm followed him through the doorway. Wind, rain, cold air. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Franklin stood. Joseph. The old man nodded. Without another word, he removed his soaked coat and sat beside the fire. I noticed something immediately. Unlike the rest of us, he didn't look frightened, concerned perhaps, serious but not afraid. That alone made him different. The old man warmed his hands near the flames. Outside, lightning flashed again. The cabin glowed white for a heartbeat, then darkness returned. Franklin gestured toward me. He saw it. Joseph's eyes settled on mine. For reasons I couldn't explain, I felt as though he were mirroring something. Not whether I was lying, whether I was ready to hear the truth. Finally he spoke. Tell me what you saw. So I did. The shadow, the valley, the wing beat, the impossible shape crossing the sky, the birds fleeing in terror, the silence that had fallen over the wilderness beforehand. I described everything. Joseph listened without interruption. When I finished, he nodded once. Then you saw Thunderbird. The certainty in his voice startled me, not a trace of doubt, not even curiosity, as though my experience confirmed something he had already known. I leaned forward. What exactly is it? The old man's gaze drifted toward the storm outside. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he began. My grandfather told me stories when I was a child. The fire crackled softly. He said, Thunderbird is older than any tribe. Another flash illuminated the cabin. He existed before villages, before hunting trails, before stories, before memory. Nobody interrupted. The old man's voice seemed to blend with the storm itself. He lives where earth meets sky. I frowned. What does that mean? Joseph looked at me. It means no man knows. The answer unsettled me, not because it lacked detail, because it sounded genuine, like a truth rather than a legend. He continued, "The mountains are only his resting places." A powerful gust struck the cabin. The walls groaned. Several men glanced nervously toward the door. Joseph didn't even look. When Thunderbird flies, storms follow. His eyes reflected the firelight. When he hunts, lightning appears. A pause. And when he becomes angry, forests fall. Nobody laughed. Nobody questioned him. The storm outside seemed to reinforce every word. I studied the old man's face. "Have you ever seen him?" Joseph remained silent, long enough to make me think he wouldn't answer. Then he nodded. Once. The room froze. Even Franklin looked surprised. "You've seen it?" Joseph stared into the flames. "Many years ago." The cabin became so quiet that I could hear rain striking the roof. I was 14. His voice had softened. "My father took me into the mountains." Lightning flashed. Thunder followed almost instantly. Closer now. Much closer. Joseph continued. "We were hunting. The animals disappeared." I felt my stomach tighten. The pattern again. Every witness described the same thing. Silence, animals fleeing, storms, then the creature. My father became frightened. Joseph's eyes narrowed at the memory. I had never seen him frightened before. Outside, the wind howled. The storm seemed to be circling the camp, almost watching it. He told me to leave. A pause. I didn't listen. For the first time, emotion appeared in the old man's face. Regret. Deep regret. I climbed higher. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The fire popped softly. Joseph stared into the flames. Then the mountain disappeared. The words sent a chill through the room. "What?" Joseph slowly looked up. The shadow covered everything. My pulse quickened. He continued. "The sky became dark. Not from clouds." A flash of lightning illuminated the cabin windows. The old man waited until the thunder faded. Then he whispered. It flew above me. No one spoke. No one dared. I could not see both wings at the same time. A long silence followed. The statement was impossible, yet somehow I believed him. The old man's voice grew quieter. My father dragged me into a cave. We stayed there until morning. The room remained frozen. Then I asked the question that had been building inside me all night. Why does it appear? Joseph looked directly at me. The expression in his eyes made my blood run cold, because for the first time since entering the cabin, he seemed afraid, not of the creature, of the answer. Finally, he spoke. Thunderbird does not come without reason. Outside, the storm suddenly intensified. The entire cabin shook. A deafening crash echoed from somewhere in the darkness. Trees snapping. Huge trees, the kind that should not break easily. Every man in the room jumped. Joseph slowly rose to his feet, his eyes fixed on the northern window. The fear on his face had returned, and this time it was unmistakable, because something in the storm had caught his attention. Something beyond the glass, something only he had noticed. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. No. The word escaped like a prayer. Everyone turned toward the window. Lightning flashed. For a fraction of a second, the mountains became visible, and standing atop the highest ridge, silhouetted against the storm, was another shape. Not Thunderbird. Something else. Something waiting. as though even the Lord of Storms had an enemy. For a moment, nobody moved. The lightning faded, darkness swallowed the mountains once more, and the shape was gone. Every man in the cabin rushed toward the window, including me. Rain lashed against the glass, wind screamed through the trees, but the ridge where the figure had stood was now empty. Only darkness remained. "What was that?" someone whispered. No one answered. I looked toward Joseph. The old man's face had become pale, not frightened, disturbed, as though he had just seen something he had hoped never to see again. Another flash lit the room. The ridge appeared, empty. Then darkness returned. Franklin stepped beside him. "What did you see?" Joseph remained silent. The question hung in the room. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains, deep, slow, almost deliberate. The old man finally spoke. "The stories say Thunderbird has enemies." Nobody liked the sound of that. I certainly didn't. "Enemies?" I asked. Joseph nodded. "There were old legends." His eyes remained fixed on the window, older than the stories most people know. The fire crackled behind us. Rain battered the roof. The tribes tell of a war. A long pause. A war in the sky. Lightning flashed again. For an instant the clouds glowed silver, then darkness returned. Joseph continued. Thunderbird was not the only powerful being. The room had become utterly silent. There were others. Creatures that lived beneath the earth. The words seemed to make the cabin colder. They hated the storms. Nobody interrupted. They hated the sky. Another thunderclap shook the building. Joseph's voice dropped lower, and they hated Thunderbird. The wind howled around the camp. For a brief moment it sounded almost like distant voices. I told myself it was imagination, nothing more, yet my pulse continued to rise. Franklin folded his arms. What creature was on that ridge? Joseph slowly shook his head. I don't know. That answer surprised everyone. If anyone knew, it should have been him. The old man stared into the darkness. But I know this. A pause. It was watching. The room remained frozen. Watching what? Joseph turned toward the northern mountains. The storm. Lightning exploded across the sky. The flash illuminated the entire valley, every tree, every cliff, every ridge. For one brief second, the wilderness appeared as bright as day, and this time, everyone saw it. The shadow. A collective gasp filled the cabin. It moved through the clouds at impossible speed, far larger than before, far larger than I remembered. The creature crossed half the visible sky in seconds, then darkness returned. Several men stumbled backward. One dropped his lantern, another muttered a prayer. No one laughed now, no one doubted. Thunderbird was real. Every man in that cabin knew it. The only question was why it had come. The answer arrived less than 10 minutes later. A scream echoed through the storm. Everyone froze. The sound came again, human, terrified, outside. Franklin grabbed a rifle. Several others did the same. The scream cut through the wind once more, closer this time. Joseph immediately stood. No. Franklin looked at him. No? The old man shook his head. Stay inside. Nobody listened. The scream came again. A man was clearly in danger. Within seconds, the cabin door opened. Rain exploded inward. The storm swallowed us completely. Immediately, the wind felt unnatural, violent, almost alive. Visibility dropped to only a few yards. Lantern light barely penetrated the darkness. The scream echoed again. From the edge of the forest, we ran toward it. Branches whipped against our faces, mud sucked our boots, lightning flashed continuously overhead. Then we found him, one of the camp workers. His name was Caleb. He lay sprawled beside a fallen tree, alive, but barely conscious. Franklin knelt beside him. What happened? Caleb's eyes were wide with terror. He pointed toward the mountains. His hand shook uncontrollably. I saw it. Nobody needed to ask what he meant. The bird? Caleb shook his head violently. No. His voice cracked. Not the bird. The words hit like ice water. Every man turned toward the mountains. Rain streamed down our faces. Lightning flashed. Thunder roared. Caleb struggled to sit upright. Then he whispered something none of us would ever forget. It was walking. The wind seemed to stop, only for a second, just long enough for everyone to hear. Walking, not flying, not soaring, walking. Franklin stared at him. What was walking? Caleb swallowed hard. His lips trembled. Then he answered, a giant. Lightning exploded overhead. The entire forest lit up, and for one terrible instant, something moved between the distant trees. A shape so enormous that it towered above the forest canopy. Not Thunderbird, not even close. This thing remained on the ground, dark, massive, humanoid, visible for only a heartbeat before the darkness swallowed it again. Several men gasped. One dropped his rifle. Another turned and ran toward camp. I stood frozen. My mind refused to process what I had seen. The figure had been impossible, too large, too tall, too enormous to exist. Then the thunder returned. A single deafening blast from somewhere above the storm. The sound rolled across the mountains like artillery fire, and for the first time that night, the giant stopped moving, as though it had heard the call, as though something in the sky had announced its arrival. The next flash of lightning revealed nothing. The giant had vanished, but somewhere high above the clouds, the Lord of Storms was circling, and whatever had emerged from the mountains below appeared to be waiting for it. We did not go back to the camp, not immediately, because something had changed in the forest. The moment that word, walking, was spoken, the wilderness no longer felt like wilderness. It felt occupied, like we were no longer alone in it. The rain had started to ease, but the wind remained aggressive, snapping through the trees in uneven bursts. Even every now and then, lightning would tear across the sky, revealing fragments of the landscape in frozen flashes. Franklin led the group. Joseph stayed behind us, moving slower, his eyes constantly fixed on the mountain ridge. Caleb had been carried between two men. He kept repeating the same phrase under his breath. It was walking. It was walking. It was walking. No one corrected him. No one wanted to. We reached a shallow clearing where the forest thinned near a collapsed rock formation. Franklin ordered us to stop. We need to understand what we're dealing with, he said. His voice was steady, but it didn't match his eyes. Those kept flicking upward, always upward. Joseph finally stepped forward. No, he said quietly. Franklin frowned. No what? No understanding it here. The old man looked toward the mountains. It listens when you speak near it. A few men exchanged uneasy looks. Franklin gave a short, humorless laugh. You're saying it can hear us talking? Joseph didn't answer the question directly. Instead, he said something worse. It knows when it is being thought about. That silenced everyone. Even the wind seemed to hesitate for a moment. Caleb let out a broken laugh from the stretcher. I saw its legs, he whispered suddenly. All heads turned toward him. He swallowed hard, trying to gather strength. It wasn't flying, he said again. It was standing. Franklin crouched beside him. Describe it. Caleb's eyes stared at nothing, as tall as the ridge trees, but shaped like a man. A pause. Not a man. His voice cracked, like something that tried to become one and never finished. A cold feeling spread through my chest. Joseph closed his eyes briefly as if unwilling to hear it. Then Caleb continued, It wasn't alone. That stopped everything. What do you mean? Franklin asked sharply. Caleb shook his head. There were more. A long silence followed. Only rainwater dripping from leaves filled the space. Joseph spoke again, very softly. The old stories never agreed on one thing. Everyone turned toward him. Some say Thunderbird is alone. A pause. Others say he is a king. That word, king, felt wrong in the forest. Franklin straightened. A king of what? Joseph looked toward the sky of the storm. Another lightning flash tore across the clouds. For a brief instant, the entire mountain range was visible again, and something in the distance moved, not high in the sky this time, lower, between the ridges. Something vast shifted behind the trees, as though the forest itself was being pushed aside. The ground trembled, not like thunder, like footsteps, heavy ones, measured, deliberate. Caleb began shaking violently. I told you, he whispered. It's walking again. Franklin raised his rifle. Everyone stayed together. But Joseph stepped forward, stopping him with a hand. No weapons, he said firmly. Franklin snapped, Why not? Joseph's voice dropped to something almost sacred. Because it's not hunting you. Another step of silence. Not yet. That was when the sound came, a deep, distant impact, not thunder, not rockfall. Something landing far beyond the ridge. The forest responded immediately. Birds erupting from branches, animals fleeing in every direction. The same pattern, always the same pattern. Then the sky answered, a low, rolling thunder that did not match the storm above. It felt directed, as if the clouds themselves had reacted. Joseph's expression changed. For the first time since we met him, he looked up in fear. Too late, he whispered. Franklin turned sharply. Too late for what? Joseph didn't answer. Instead, he pointed toward the highest ridge. And there, in the flickering light of distant lightning, we saw it clearly. The shape, not flying, standing. A colossal silhouette carved against the storm, its outline barely contained by the horizon itself, and for the first time, we understood Caleb had been telling the truth. It wasn't just walking, it was approaching. We moved because standing still felt like waiting to be noticed. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood the same thing. Whatever was in the mountains had seen us. The moment that thought settled in, the forest stopped feeling like shelter. It became exposure. We retreated toward a narrow ravine where the trees grew denser and the wind struggled to reach us. The ground there was uneven, broken by roots and stone, forcing us to move carefully. Caleb had stopped speaking entirely. That worried me more than anything he had said. Joseph walked beside Franklin now, their conversation low and tense. "It's not fully here," Joseph said. Franklin glanced at him. "What does that mean?" Joseph hesitated. "It is crossing." The words made no sense at first. "Crossing from where?" Franklin asked. Joseph didn't answer immediately. Then, "Between places." Lightning flashed far above the valley, but the sound that followed was delayed. Wrong. Like the sky itself was out of sync. A few seconds passed before thunder arrived. That delay changed everything. Even Franklin noticed it. "That's not natural," he muttered. Joseph nodded once. "No." A pause. "Because it is not weather." The forest around us seemed to tighten. Branches creaked. Somewhere in the distance, a tree snapped clean in half. Not by wind, by force. We froze. Another impact followed. Closer, much closer. Caleb suddenly spoke again. "It's not alone," he repeated weakly. Franklin turned sharply. "You said that already." Caleb shook his head. "No, I mean it's not alone now." A chill ran through the group. Joseph stopped walking. Slowly, he looked upward. For the first time since this began, his certainty broke. "What did you see?" Franklin asked quietly. Joseph's voice came out strained. "Something old." Another silence. Then he added, "Older than Thunderbird." That statement should have sounded like madness. Instead, it felt like confirmation of everything wrong with the world. A low vibration passed through the ground. Not thunder, not wind. Something moving beneath us. The ravine walls trembled slightly, dust falling from the rock above. Caleb whispered, "It's under us too." Franklin raised his rifle again, scanning the darkness. "Everyone move. Now." We began to push forward again, faster this time. But the forest ahead was changing. The air itself felt heavier, thicker, like pressure before a storm, but deeper, more physical. Then we heard it. A sound from above the ravine, not a wing beat, not thunder, a voice, low, distant, not human, but structured, like language trying to exist. Everyone stopped, even Franklin. Joseph closed his eyes, a resonance that traveled through bone more than air. It didn't form words we could understand, but it carried meaning anyway. Arrival, recognition, conflict. Joseph spoke without opening his eyes. "They have found each other." Franklin looked furious. "Who has found who?" Joseph finally opened his eyes, and what I saw there made my stomach drop. Fear, absolute fear. "Thunderbird," he said, "and the thing beneath." The ravine went silent. Even the wind seemed to disappear. Then, far above us, the storm answered, not with thunder, but with a single, impossible roar. The kind that does not belong to sky or earth. It belonged to something vast enough to make both seem small. Every man in the ravine looked upward at once, and through the broken clouds, we saw the first collision of something that should never have met. Lightning exploded across the sky, and for a moment, the storm became a battlefield. The sky broke before the ground did. That was the only way I could later describe it. Lightning didn't just strike anymore, it fractured, splitting the clouds into glowing veins of white fire. The storm above the mountains had turned into something violent and intentional, as if two unseen forces were tearing it apart from opposite sides, one above, one below, and we were trapped in between. From the ravine, we could see the battlefield clearly now. The storm was no longer a sky, it was a domain, and something vast was moving through it. Thunderbird appeared first, not fully, never fully, just fragments of impossible scale, wings cutting through the clouds, each movement rewriting the shape of the storm. Every wing beat bent the weather itself, dragging lightning behind it like chains of light. But beneath it, something answered. The ground trembled again, not in rhythm with thunder, in opposition to it. Franklin whispered, "Dear God," but his voice was lost in the sound that followed. A second force rose into view, not flying, ascending. From the ridges below the storm came a shape so massive it displaced fog, trees, and even darkness itself. It did not glow, it did not flash, it absorbed light instead, as though the world around it struggled to define its edges. Caleb began shaking violently. "I told you," he whispered. "It walks." Joseph stepped forward, nearly losing balance. "This should not be seen," he said, and for the first time his voice carried something beyond fear. Warning. Above us, Thunderbird struck, a wing beat like the collapse of the sky itself. The storm exploded outward in response, lightning scattered in every direction, striking mountains, splitting trees, igniting the air itself, and the thing below responded. It lifted one arm, just one, and the wind reversed direction. Every man in the ravine staggered backward as pressure slammed into us like an invisible wall. Franklin shouted, "Get down!" But nobody moved fast enough, because what we were witnessing was no longer distance. It was scale, unthinkable scale. Two forces shaped the horizon now. Thunderbird in the sky, dominant, ancient, impossible, and the thing beneath, equally vast, equally wrong, rising as if it had waited beneath the world for ages without end. Joseph's voice cracked through the chaos. They were never meant to meet. A flash of lightning revealed them both at once. For a fraction of a second, the entire world became visible. Thunderbird's wings stretched across half the storm, each feather like a moving mountain of shadow and electricity, and the other stood beneath the clouds like a pillar of living earth, its head brushing the lowest part of the storm, its presence bending the landscape around it. Then they collided. The impact did not create sound at first, it created absence. All noise vanished, even thunder stopped existing for a heartbeat. Then the sound arrived, not one sound, a cascade, a rolling collapse of reality itself. The ravine shook so violently that several men fell. Tree above us snapped like dry sticks. The river nearby reversed direction for a moment before exploding outward in spray. Caleb screamed something unintelligible. Franklin was on his knees, covering his ears. Joseph remained standing, staring upward, as if witnessing something written into his blood long before he was born. "They are remembering," he said quietly. I looked at him. "What does that mean?" But he didn't answer, because the sky answered instead. Thunderbird descended, not falling, attacking, and the thing below raised both arms this time. What followed was not a battle, it was a rewriting of the storm itself. Lightning no longer struck randomly, it obeyed. Wind no longer moved freely, it was forced. The entire sky became a weapon being shaped by two ancient intelligences locked in conflict above the mountains, and somewhere far below that chaos, We were nothing more than witnesses to a war that had been happening long before humans ever learned to name thunder. The storm was no longer weather, it was memory being forced open. That thought came to me uninvited as I stood in the ravine staring upward at something no human mind was meant to process for long. Above us, the war had changed shape again. Thunderbird no longer moved like a single creature. It split, not into parts, but into expressions of itself. Every strike of lightning, every fracture in the clouds, every rolling wave of thunder felt like extensions of its will. The sky had become its body in motion, and the thing beneath was responding in kind. The earth rose, not metaphorically, physically. From the ridges and valleys below, the ground itself seemed to swell upward in slow, impossible pressure, as if something buried for ages was finally remembering how to exist above soil. Caleb whispered hoarsely, "It's waking it up." Franklin snapped at him, "What is?" Caleb's eyes were empty now. "The ground," he said. "It's waking up the ground." Joseph moved forward, placing himself between us and the open ravine edge. "No one looks directly," he said firmly. But it was too late, because we were already seeing it. The lower half of the battlefield was becoming visible through gaps in the storm, and what we saw there made every instinct in my body reject the world I stood in. Massive shapes, like structures, like bodies, like something between both, were rising from beneath the terrain, not fully formed, not fully defined, but unmistakably alive in the way they shifted, adjusted, and reacted to Thunderbird's presence above. Franklin lowered his rifle slowly. "There are more of them," he said, voice hollow. Joseph nodded once. "Yes." A pause. "Many more." Another flash of lightning tore through the sky, and for a moment the entire battlefield became visible again. Thunderbird descended in a spiral of stormlight, wings carving arcs through the clouds. Each movement reshaped wind currents into violent spirals that ripped across the mountains and below. The earth answered. One of the rising shapes lifted an arm again. The gesture was slower this time, heavier, and as it moved, the ground cracked open along fault lines that had likely existed since before any human ever walked these lands. Caleb began shaking uncontrollably. "They were remembering each other," he said. Joseph turned sharply, stopped speaking, but Caleb continued anyway. "They fought before," he whispered. "They buried each other." That word "buried" changed the air. The wind itself seemed to hesitate. Franklin looked at Joseph. "You knew about this." It wasn't a question anymore. Joseph didn't deny it. "I knew stories," he said. A pause. Not the ending. Above us, Thunderbird struck again. This time, the impact was not thunder. It was pressure, a force so immense that the ravine walls cracked outward, stone fractured, trees bent without wind touching them, and the earth-born thing responded. It pushed upward, not toward the sky, toward Thunderbird. The collision point between sky and ground ignited in pure white light. For a moment, there was no distinction between storm and land, only force, only opposition, only something ancient trying to erase something equally ancient. Franklin shouted, "We need to leave, now." But Joseph didn't move. None of us did, because movement felt irrelevant. The battle above and below had expanded beyond geography. It had become scale itself. Thunderbird's wings stretched wider than the storm system now visible across the horizon. Every beat shifted entire weather fronts. Lightning followed it like loyal hunters, and the earth being rose higher than any mountain peak in sight, its form still undefined, still assembling itself from something deeper than rock or soil. Then, suddenly, everything stopped. Not ended, stopped. The storm froze mid-motion, lightning suspended in jagged lines across the sky, wind held still between breaths. Even the ground's vibration ceased. Joseph exhaled sharply. "They've reached alignment," he said. Franklin turned toward him. "What does that mean?" Joseph's voice dropped to something almost inaudible. "Decision." A silence stretched across the entire world, and in that silence, something between sky and earth finally looked down, not at each other, at us. I am leaving the second part from here, and if single one of you comments to continue the story, I will do it for even a single person. You just have to comment, continue, and I will obey. Subscribe to watch more stories.